On the morning of February 19th, 1942, the town of Darwin was the picture of tropical serenity. Perched on the northern edge of the Australian continent, Darwin felt worlds away from the cataclysmic struggles engulfing Europe and Asia. The sun rose over a sparkling harbor filled with Allied warships, merchant vessels, and civilian ferries. Residents went about their morning routines, sipping tea and preparing for a humid day of labor, while dock workers unloaded vital supplies destined for the front lines of the Pacific. To the casual observer, Darwin was a sleepy colonial outpost, but in reality, it was a ticking time bomb, a strategic prize that had just appeared on the crosshairs of the Imperial Japanese Navy. The peace was shattered at exactly 9:58 a.m., but the tragedy began with a silent, invisible failure. For years, the vast geography of the Australian outback and the surrounding seas had acted as a natural moat, providing a sense of invulnerability. That morning, that illusion of safety vanished forever. The air, once filled with the calls of tropical birds, was suddenly drowned out by a low rhythmic throb that vibrated through the very earth. It was the sound of nearly 200 aircraft, an aerial armada so vast it darkened the horizon. In a matter of minutes, the azure sky over Darwin was transformed into a chaotic canvas of fire, smoke, and screaming metal. This was the Pearl Harbor of Australia, a day of infamy that remains the single deadliest foreign attack on Australian soil. The comparison to Pearl Harbor is not merely poetic, it is literal. The force descending upon Darwin was led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same commander who had orchestrated the strike on Hawaii just 10 weeks prior. The same pilots who had sunk the American battleships were now banking their Zeros and Kates over the Australian coastline, bringing with them a level of coordinated destruction that the continent had never witnessed. The shock was total. As the first sticks of bombs began to walk across the harbor, tearing through the hulls of ships and turning the wharf into a twisted graveyard of timber and steel, the people of Darwin realized with horrifying clarity that the war was no longer over there. It was here in their streets, their homes, and their harbor. The geographical isolation that Australians had long relied upon had failed them. The front door of the country had been kicked open with a violence that shook the foundations of the nation. This episode explores the harrowing reality of the Darwin air raids, a story of strategic blunders, overlooked warnings, and the raw courage of those who fought back against impossible odds. It is the story of how a peaceful morning turned into a nightmare of oil-slicked waters and burning ruins, and how the smoke rising from Darwin Harbor signaled the birth of a new, resilient Australia. As we look back at the carnage of February 19th, we must ask, how did a nation so far from the heart of the conflict find itself at the center of a storm that would change the Pacific forever? To understand the ferocity of the attack on Darwin, one must look past the smoke of the harbor and into the cold, calculating halls of the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters. In early 1942, the Japanese southern operation was moving with the unstoppable momentum of a tidal wave. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable bastion of British power, had fallen on February 15th, just 4 days before the bombs fell on Darwin. The Japanese next set their sights on the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, specifically the islands of Java and Timor. In this grand strategic puzzle, Darwin was not a target for conquest, but a vital piece that had to be neutralized. For decades, a lingering fear known as the Brisbane Line had haunted Australian military planning, the terrifying idea that Japan intended to invade and occupy the entire continent. However, historical records and captured Japanese documents reveal a different reality. The Japanese High Command realized that occupying Australia, a landmass nearly the size of the United States with vast, harsh interiors, would be a logistical nightmare that would overextend their resources. Instead, their objective was strategic paralysis. They didn't want to own Australia. They wanted to isolate it and ensure it could not be used as a platform for recovery by the United States. Darwin was the linchpin of Allied resistance in the region. It served as the primary supply hub and refueling station for the American, Australian, and Dutch forces attempting to hold the Malay Barrier. If the Allies could keep Darwin operational, they could continue to funnel reinforcements, aircraft, and fuel to the embattled defenders of Java and Timor. To the Japanese, Darwin was a dangerous, unsinkable aircraft carrier, sitting just across the Arafura Sea. By destroying its port facilities and airfields, The Japanese aimed to sever the lifeline of the Southern Pacific, effectively orphaning the remaining Allied troops in Southeast Asia. The timing of the raid was surgical. Japan was preparing for its amphibious landings on Timor, scheduled for February 20th. They could not risk Allied bombers from Darwin attacking their invasion fleet or American warships, disrupting their troop transports. Therefore, the raid on February 19th was a massive, preemptive strike. It was designed to achieve what military theorists call area denial, turning Darwin into a smoking ruin so that no Allied ship or plane could use it to interfere with Japan's southward expansion. As the four Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, slipped into position in the Timor Sea, the pilots were briefed not on a mission of occupation, but on a mission of total destruction. They were to hammer the infrastructure of the town until it was useless. This wasn't just a raid, it was a strategic execution. By the time the first bombs left the bays, Darwin had already been condemned by its own geography. It was the last door standing between Japan and the total control of the East Indies, and the Japanese were determined to blow that door off its hinges. The force that appeared over the horizon of the Timor Sea was not merely a group of raiders. It was the most lethal naval aviation unit on the planet. This was the Kido Butai, the first carrier strike force of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Having already humiliated the United States at Pearl Harbor and swept through the Western Pacific, the Japanese pilots possessed a level of confidence that bordered on a sense of divine destiny. They were the ghosts in the sky, flying machines that were technically superior and operated by crews whose combat experience was unparalleled in the early days of 1942. At the heart of this armada were four of the six carriers that had attacked Hawaii: the Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu. On their flight deck sat 188 aircraft ready for the first wave. The strike was led by the legendary commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the same man who had radioed the famous Tora 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 signal over Oahu. Under his command was a terrifying trifecta of aviation technology: the Mitsubishi A-6 Sim-0 fighters, the Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, reconfigured for high-altitude bombing, and the Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers. The Zeros, in particular, were the masters of the Pacific skies, faster, more maneuverable, and more heavily armed than anything the Australians could put into the air. In addition to the carrier-borne fleet, the Japanese launched a secondary wave of 54 land-based heavy bombers from captured airfields in Ambon and Kandari. These twin-engine Nell and Betty bombers were designed for long-range devastation, intended to carpet bomb the military installations in RAF airfields. The coordination was a masterpiece of Japanese naval doctrine. By attacking with both carrier planes and land-based bombers, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo ensured that Darwin would be hit from multiple angles, leaving no corner of the town or harbor safe from the deluge of fire. The Japanese pilots viewed the mission with a mixture of professional detachment and predatory focus. To them, Darwin was a soft target. Their intelligence had correctly identified that the town's defenses were negligible compared to the massive American installations they had faced 10 weeks earlier. They knew the Allied air strength in the area was fractured and that the anti-aircraft batteries were insufficient. As the 188 planes of the first wave formed up into their V-shaped V patterns, the roar of nearly 200 engines created a psychological shockwave that arrived long before the first bomb. The presence of the Kido Butai in the Timor Sea signaled a terrifying new reality. The spearhead of the Japanese Empire had reached the southern hemisphere. These were the elite of the elite, men who had been trained since the mid-1930s in the crucible of the war in China. As they banked their planes toward the Australian coastline, guided by the glistening waters of the harbor, they weren't just bringing bombs. They were bringing a totalizing form of warfare that the Australian continent had never been prepared to face. The ghosts in the sky were about to turn the quiet morning of a peaceful nation into a permanent scar on its history. The tragedy of Darwin was not just born of Japanese strength, but of a catastrophic failure in the Allied chain of command. As the Japanese armada closed in, the fate of the town rested on a series of warnings that were tragically ignored or misunderstood. The most haunting of these lost opportunities occurred on Bathurst Island, roughly 80 kilometers north of Darwin. At 9:35 a.m., 23 minutes before the first bomb fell, Father John McGrath, a Catholic missionary, looked up to see a massive formation of aircraft passing directly over his mission station. Recognizing the threat, he rushed to his radio and transmitted an urgent message to the amalgamated wireless station in Darwin. An unusually large air formation of aircraft is flying south, bound for Darwin. This warning was received by the Royal Australian Air Force, RAAF Operations Center. However, in a move that mirrors the fatal errors made at Pearl Harbor, the report was dismissed. The senior officers on duty concluded that the formation was likely a group of 10 American P-40 Kitty Hawk fighters that had departed for Java earlier that morning, but were forced back by bad weather. The difference between 10 returning friendly fighters and nearly 200 enemy bombers was the difference between life and death for the city. Yet no air raid sirens were sounded. The fatal silence of the sirens meant that dock workers remained on the piers, sailors stayed on their ships, and civilians continued their morning tasks, completely unaware that a tsunami of fire was seconds away. The physical defenses of the town were equally woeful. Darwin's anti-aircraft batteries consisted of a handful of aging 3-inch and 3.7-inch guns, many manned by crews who had never seen real combat. The RAAF's aerial defense was virtually non-existent. The few Wirraway trainers and Lockheed Hudsons available were hopelessly outclassed. The only modern interceptors were the aforementioned American P-40s. When the Japanese Zeros finally descended, the American pilots fought with suicidal bravery, but they were caught in the most vulnerable position possible, either still on the tarmac or struggling for altitude. They were systematically hunted down and shredded by the superior Zeros before they could mount a coordinated defense. This systemic collapse was exacerbated by a lack of civil preparedness. Unlike the cities of Europe, Darwin had no sophisticated radar network, no blackout drills, and very few public bomb shelters. The government had prioritized the Singapore strategy, believing that the British naval base to the north would act as an impenetrable shield. When Singapore fell, that shield shattered, leaving Darwin exposed and naked. The result of this fatal silence was a massacre of the unsuspecting. When the Japanese dive bombers finally rolled into their steep descents at 9:58 a.m., the first indication for many was not a siren, but the terrifying whistle of falling ordnance and the earth-shattering roar of explosions. By the time the first anti-aircraft gun opened fire, the harbor was already a cauldron of flame. The failure to heed Father McGrath's warning had ensured that the Pearl Harbor of Australia would be every bit as surprising and every bit as deadly as the original. At 9:58 a.m., the deceptive silence of Darwin was obliterated by the first scream of a VAL dive bomber. The first wave, a concentrated fury of 188 aircraft, targeted the harbor with surgical cruelty. Within seconds, the tranquil blue waters were transformed into a hellscape of erupting geysers and black, oily smoke. The Japanese pilots focused their wrath on the crowded shipping lanes. The USS Peary, an American destroyer, was struck multiple times and sank rapidly, taking 88 brave sailors with her into the depths. The wharf, a vital artery of the town, was severed by a direct hit, trapping dock workers in a zone of fire and falling debris. Ships like the Neptuna, loaded with 200 depth charges, became floating powder kegs. When she eventually exploded, the shock wave was so immense it shattered windows across the town. The carnage in the harbor was exacerbated by a horrific new element, burning oil. As tankers were ripped open by torpedoes and bombs, thousands of gallons of fuel oil spilled onto the surface and ignited. Sailors who jumped from their sinking ships to escape the fire on deck found themselves swimming in a literal sea of flame. The VAL pilots, having exhausted their bombs, descended to mast height, using their machine guns to strafe survivors struggling in the water. It was a scene of unmitigated slaughter that lasted nearly 40 minutes, leaving 9 ships at the bottom of the bay and 23 others crippled and burning. Just as the survivors began to crawl from the wreckage, believing the nightmare was over, the second wave arrived at 11:58 a.m. This attack was different in nature, but equal in its lethality. 54 land-based heavy bombers, flying in perfect menacing formations at high altitude, rained destruction upon the RAAF airfield and military installations. This was carpet bombing designed to ensure that the infrastructure of Darwin was rendered useless. The airfield was turned into a moonscape of craters, Hangars were leveled, and nearly every Allied aircraft on the ground was reduced to charred skeletons of aluminum. The second wave did not discriminate between military and civilian targets. Bombs fell on the Darwin post office, killing 9 people, including the postmaster and his family. The government house and the local hospital were hit, creating scenes of chaos as doctors and nurses struggled to treat the wounded while the ceiling collapsed around them. The precision of the first wave had crippled the fleet, but the heavy hammers of the second wave broke the spirit of the town's infrastructure. By the time the last Japanese bomber turned north toward the safety of the Timor Sea, Darwin was unrecognizable. Over 250 people were dead, though the exact number remains a subject of historical debate. The harbor was a graveyard of mass poking through the oily tide, and the sky was a bruised purple, choked by the soot of a burning city. In just 2 hours of rain of fire, the Japanese had achieved their objective. Darwin was neutralized, its front door was shattered, and the myth of Australian continental safety lay buried under the rubble. In the immediate wake of the second wave, the physical destruction of Darwin was followed by a total collapse of social and military order. As the smoke cleared, a terrifying rumor swept through the ruins. The air raids were merely the prelude to a full-scale Japanese amphibious invasion. With the harbor in flames and the airfield shattered, many believed that the Imperial Japanese Army would be on the beaches by nightfall. This sparked what became known as the Adelaide River Stake, a disorganized, panicked exodus of thousands of civilians and military personnel fleeing southward into the harsh Australian interior. The panic was not limited to the civilian population. In one of the most controversial chapters of Australian military history, a breakdown in leadership occurred at the RAAF base. Following the destruction of their hangars and mess halls, an ambiguous order was issued that was interpreted by many as every man for himself. In the confusion, 278 RAAF servicemen were later accused of desertion. While many were simply seeking food and shelter in the chaos, the sight of uniformed men fleeing alongside civilians added to the sense of national humiliation. It would take decades for a commission of inquiry to officially vindicate many of these men, citing the total lack of clear orders and the psychological trauma of the unprecedented bombardment. The Australian government's response added another layer of complexity to the tragedy. Fearing that the truth would cause a nationwide collapse in morale, Prime Minister John Curtin's administration drastically downplayed the casualty figures. Official reports initially claimed that only 17 people had been killed. In reality, more than 250 had perished, and the town was a smoldering shell. This strategic silence created a divide between the survivors in the north, who had seen the carnage firsthand, and the rest of the country, who remained largely unaware of the sheer scale of the disaster. The flight from Darwin saw people using anything that could move, trucks, bicycles, and even horses, to escape down the track toward Adelaide River and beyond. Families abandoned their homes with half-eaten meals still on the table, and the town's essential services ground to a halt. The chaos was a sobering lesson in the fragility of civil society under the pressure of total war. It revealed a nation that was emotionally and logistically unprepared for the reality of being a primary target. However, the Great Panic was also a catalyst for change. The embarrassment of the desertion charges and the chaos of the evacuation forced the Australian military to radically overhaul its command structure and civil defense protocols. The tragedy at Darwin acted as a brutal wake-up call. It proved that secrecy could be just as damaging as the bombs themselves, and that the only way to survive the coming years of war was through transparency, better leadership, and an unshakable resolve that began at the very edge of the continent. The smoke rising from Darwin Harbor signaled the end of more than just a peaceful morning. It marked the end of Australia's Age of Innocence. Pashuan. For over a century, Australia had rested comfortably under the perceived protection of the British Empire. The Singapore strategy, the belief that the British naval fortress to the north would act as an impenetrable barrier, had been the cornerstone of Australian defense. However, as the Japanese bombs fell on Darwin, that cornerstone crumbled into dust. The realization was as swift as it was brutal. Britain, struggling for its own survival in Europe, could no longer protect its Pacific dominion. Australia was, for the first time in its history, truly alone and staring into the abyss. This trauma forced a radical and historic pivot in Australian foreign policy. In a famous and controversial address, Prime Minister John Curtin declared, "Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom." The attack on Darwin accelerated this shift from London to Washington. It was no longer a matter of sentiment, it was a matter of national survival. The carnage of February 19th proved that Australia needed a partner with the industrial capacity and naval reach to match the Japanese juggernaut. This was the strategic awakening that would eventually lead to the formal ANZUS Treaty, forever changing the geopolitical landscape of the Southern Hemisphere. Darwin itself underwent a metamorphosis. Once a remote colonial town, it was rapidly rebuilt into a massive, integrated Allied military hub. The disaster had proven that Darwin was the front door of the nation, and that door now had to be reinforced with steel. Thousands of American GIs and Australian troops poured into the north, bringing with them modern radar systems, heavy anti-aircraft batteries, and squadrons of advanced fighter aircraft. The fatal silence of February 19th was replaced by the constant roar of a town that had become a fortress. This period cemented the mateship between Australian and American forces as they lived and worked side by side in the harsh conditions of the top end. The strategic significance of Darwin shifted from a vulnerable target to an aggressive springboard. From the ruins of the 1942 raids, the Allies built the airfields that would eventually launch the counter-offensives into the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines. The Japanese had intended to paralyze Darwin to protect their flank, but their attack had the opposite effect. It awakened a sleeping giant in the south, turning Australia into an aircraft carrier that the Imperial Japanese Navy could never sink. Ultimately, the attack on Darwin served as the ultimate catalyst for Australia's maturity as a sovereign nation. It forced the country to define its own defense priorities, forge its own alliances, and recognize its unique position as a Western democracy in the heart of the Asia-Pacific. The strategic awakening ensured that while Darwin had been the site of a great tragedy, it would also be the place where Australia found the strength to stand on its own 2 feet, anchored by a new and enduring alliance that would define the post-war world. The echoes of the Japanese bombs have long since faded from the skies over the Northern Territory, but the scars they left on the Australian psyche remain indelible. The attack on Darwin was a definitive moment of national loss, a day when the abstract concept of war became a visceral, burning reality for every Australian family. Today, Darwin is a vibrant, modern city, but it is also a living memorial. In the rusted remains of shipwrecks still resting beneath the harbor tides and the bullet-scarred walls of the old administrative buildings, the history of February 19, 1942 continues to whisper its warnings to future generations. The most enduring lesson of Darwin is that geography is no longer a shield. In a world of long-range aviation and globalized conflict, the tyranny of distance can be bridged in a single morning. The 1942 raids shattered the myth of isolation, teaching Australia that its security is inextricably linked to the stability of its northern neighbors. This realization has become the bedrock of modern Australian defense doctrine, a doctrine built on constant vigilance, high-tech early warning systems, and the maintenance of a robust, ready-to-act military force at the country's front door. Equally important is the legacy of the U.S.-Australian alliance. What began as a desperate plea for help from Prime Minister Curtin has evolved into one of the most stable and integrated military partnerships in history. Darwin remains the symbolic and practical heart of this bond. Every year, thousands of U.S. Marines rotate through the city, training alongside Australian diggers in the same scrub and heat where their grandfathers once stood watch. The Adelaide River Stake and the chaos of 1942 are no longer seen as points of shame, but as the painful birth pangs of a relationship that now serves as a cornerstone of Pacific peace. For the people of Darwin, the commemoration of the air raids is a deeply personal affair. Every year on February 19th, a siren wails across the city at exactly 9:58 a.m. For a few minutes, the bustling commerce of the modern capital stops. It is a moment to honor the 250 men, women, and children who perished, not as soldiers on a distant battlefield, but as citizens in their own harbor. The famous local sentiment, "We do not forget and we do not forgive," has softened over the decades into a more contemplative stance of reconciliation and remembrance. But the core of that message remains. Australia will never again allow itself to be caught sleeping. The story of the Darwin air raid of 1942 is a testament to the resilience of a people who refuse to be broken by a rain of fire. It is a reminder that while war can destroy buildings and sink ships, it cannot extinguish the spirit of a community determined to rebuild. As the sun sets over the quiet, peaceful waters of the harbor today, it illuminates a city that knows the true value of its safety because it has felt the heat of its loss. Darwin stands as a sentinel, a beautiful city born from the ashes of a tragedy, forever reminding the world that even the farthest shores are never beyond the reach of history.